Hello, and welcome to the Three Bozos podcast with Max, Josh, and Zack. We will be discussing the validity of certain COVID-19 mandates, such as a mask mandate and vaccination mandates. This topic is important to us because we are going through a period of significant amount of change in our lives, such as transitioning to college and moving away from home for the first time during this pandemic. To start off, I would like to introduce a subject or a situation that I found very, very startling. The U.S. men's national soccer team played El Salvador on January 27th in Cincinnati, with 27,000 people attending in Lower.com Stadium. There were no COVID restrictions in place. Do you think this is dangerous? Why or why not? Josh, I would like you to go first.
Okay, so I don't think it's dangerous for a lot of reasons. First of all, coronavirus at this point is very non-deadly. If anyone were to get it, the vast majority of them would be totally fine. We have had a few people die. Data from the CDC says that most people who die from Omicron after vaccination had 4 comorbidities. That means they had diabetes, a heart problem, a lung problem, and maybe immunodeficiency. Not many people have 4 problems, and very, very few people who are going to be at, for example, a soccer game with 4 comorbidities would not be taking any other measures by themselves. If you have 4 comorbidities, you're probably already wearing a mask and getting vaccinated against anything you can get vaccinated against, because anything at that point is a risk. For the rest of us, Omicron isn't going to be very serious if we get it. A lot of people, especially with this new variant, they're calling it the stealth variant, because even if you get it, a lot of times it can be hard to tell, and so you can pass it to other people and you don't know that you're passing it. That seems like a bad thing, and it is, until you consider that the reason that you don't know that you have it is because you're not showing serious symptoms.
Zack, what's your opinion on this?
My opinion on the soccer game in Cincinnati, about 2,000 people, correct?
27,000.
20,000. I can't read apparently because commas are hard to see. My opinion is that it is what he was saying, is that it's about like risk and how it can be dangerous and how it can't be dangerous, and how within a situation with 20,000 people and with a virus going around that can spread very fast, like he was saying, it can be dangerous, where yes, the people going aren't going to be hurt because, well, they aren't going to have 4 separate ailments that they're having that makes them more open to the virus, is that they could spread it to other people that do have those that openness and danger. And that is the real issue, rather than the people being there at the game. It is the people that they're going to hang out with afterwards, or the people that they're going home to have some dinner with, or their family, or their friends that they know. And that's where the real danger lies, is with events like this.
So on the topic of closely packed, large groups of people, and that should or should not be wearing a mask. A lot of governments have left that up to personal decision. On the topic of personal decision, do you think state governments, or in turn any national government internationally, should have the power to enforce a mask mandate? Zack, I'll let you go first.
I think this one is a fine line to walk for mask mandates for governments, because I can see the validity in both options, where if it's too much, then it's too much and needs to be dialed back. But then there also needs to be some baseline of care, because without it, then people aren't a lot of people aren't going to care. And so I think walking a fine line of having, okay, in indoor places where you're in close proximity like we are right now, where wearing a mask is a good idea because we are within 6 feet. And the government coming out and saying, hey, if you're in situations like this where we're within enclosed space, then I think that is valid. But in situations where you're just walking in a huge store where nobody's within like 20 feet of you, then I don't think it works. And so that's when it comes to, I think, private business owners making that decision and the government stepping out from it.
Very interesting. Not the position that many people have, and I loved your opinion on that, Josh.
Right, so we just had a situation where Kathy Hochul's mask mandate was struck down by a court. It was actually put back in place in some settings, and it sparks a lot of debate about whether mask mandates are valid, and I don't think that they are. When they're coming down from a huge body like the state, we see that especially in cities, mask mandates haven't had a huge effect. We see Los Angeles County, they have the mask mandate, 306 daily diagnoses for 100,000 people. That means in a population of 100,000 people, 306 people are getting diagnosed with COVID every day. In Cook County, that's Chicago, 116 per 100,000. In Suffolk County, that's Boston, 158.7 per 100,000. Now, Texas, Governor Abbott in Texas banned mask mandates for the vast majority of cases. It's been installed in schools, and I actually like to go on a quick aside about it. If you see in the doc that comes along with this podcast, you'll see a picture of Trevor Noah having fun at a basketball game, which is great. The only thing you won't notice is a lot of masks. There's one mask being worn correctly. Everyone else is either having it under their nose or isn't wearing one at all, or is wearing a cloth mask. And we know from people like Rochelle Walensky, the head of the CDC, and Scott Gottlieb, former FDA commissioner, that cloth masks really aren't that effective against COVID. So that's one mask in that whole picture, probably 20 people, one mask. The second picture is a picture of a classroom, and every single student is masked. Now, we know that children are the least vulnerable people, and so what this tells me is that mask mandates, if they are applied, number one, aren't working, as we see from the city data, and number two, are applied to situations where they're not going to help that much because they're applied to the people that Omicron least affects. And then Harris County, that's Houston, Texas, it's 116.8 per 100,000. So it's in the bottom of the list of counties with COVID, and they don't have a mask mandate, and Houston's not an anomaly. So yeah, that's my position on mask mandates.
Just like a quick aside from the different age groups, as you mentioned in your argument, do you think that different age groups should be held to different standards based on their immunity or lack thereof to COVID, because the possibility of them getting COVID is less, or the possibility of them getting seriously hurt from COVID is less? Or do you think that everyone should be held up to the same standard?
I absolutely agree with you that I agree that we need to apply different levels of protection to different groups of people, because different groups of people react to COVID differently. We've seen the vast majority of deaths have been of elderly people and people with comorbidities like diabetes or heart issues. This means that we need to be protecting different people differently. Older people need to be protected more because they're more vulnerable to COVID, whereas people like us, young, healthy, we're not going to suffer from COVID nearly as harshly, and so we don't need the kind of protection that certain people do. There's no other area of life that I can think of where we know of an obvious differential in a reaction to a disease, and yet we treat everyone the same way, or even other things other than a disease.
I think it would be unreasonable to say otherwise, because like he's saying, it's we as in our age react differently compared to someone who's 80, and I think that's where COVID mandates should start to focus more on is for people who are actually in danger and who are being threatened by COVID. It should start to focus more on providing care and helping people overcome COVID and give them the supplies necessary to deal with it for the elderly and those who are at risk, and helping provide ways for them to not only stay safe but to also just live their lives while also trying to not die from COVID.
And on the topic of living their lives, I noticed one massive city on this continent switched to a live-in policy. A live-in policy is basically you go back to work when you feel better. There's no quarantine period. And that city is Toronto, Canada. Now this is in stark contrast with their forward national policy of them limiting capacities, limiting social gatherings to almost a bare minimum. Do you think that this is a policy that you'll start to see a little bit more?
Here's what I found from your diction.
Nice. That you'll start to see a little bit more of, and start to see a little bit more in practice once, Toronto is, the guinea pig, once the Toronto, for lack of a better term, experiment turns out.
Absolutely, and we're sort of already seeing that already. In hospitals around the country, doctors who are positive with COVID are being called back to work once they're asymptomatic. Let me say it again, doctors who are positive with COVID are going back to the hospital, they're being called back to work as soon as they're asymptomatic. And I think we're gonna see that spread to all facets of life across the country. If you're feeling sick, stay home. If you're not feeling sick, if you're asymptomatic, come back. I think that's gonna take over every facet of life pretty soon. We're gonna see that people can come back to work and can go back to school once they're asymptomatic.
And again, I'm not gonna disagree with staying home when you're sick, because that's kind of the point that I'm making, is that these mandates and that these masks and wearing masks are helpful. But it also has to be, I think, measured in some way, that because there is a chance that you may still have antibodies, COVID antibodies within you, but it's not enough to make you sick, but that's still spreadable. And that, I think, is a real issue with people being, well, it's not an issue, but the reason why people quarantine for longer is so that the antibody levels can die down rather than stay at an active level. Because you can be sick with a cold and you won't show symptoms for like the first day or so of having it. And then the next day, boom, you're sick. And that's kind of the way it is with COVID, where you have the antibodies, you aren't showing symptoms, and then all of a sudden you're sick and you feel like you're dying.
So, Josh actually both of you brought up really good points of being asymptomatic. One way to combat the asymptomatic version, I don't really have a better way to put that, is universal testing. Now, many people have argued that universal testing is a waste of government resources. Do you think this is true? Why or why not, Zach? Zach, go first.
Universal testing, could you elaborate on that concept?
Universal testing, as in, hey, you got contact trace, go get tested. It's more of what we were doing initially, where everyone, if you came in contact with a person who got COVID, you're required to go get tested. If you didn't feel particularly well, could just be allergies, or could just be, you had an off day, or you didn't feel like yourself, you're required to go get tested. It's more just test to be safe than be sick and sorry if you do have it.
I think, okay, so for universal testing, I think, if you come into contact with someone who has told you like later is like, hey, you know, we met up like last night, I just tested positive for COVID. And I think it would put other people just at risk, just going out and trying to get tested. And so since you know that you came into contact with someone who had COVID, it's almost common sense to just be like, okay, I'm just gonna self-quarantine for a few days, and like, oh, no symptoms, okay.
Then we'll go and see where that.
Yeah, and then you're just like, and if you feel sick, just, you don't need to be tested to know that you feel sick. You can just go and stay quarantined until you feel better, and then give it a few days for the antibodies to just lower down. I think I just shocked my chair, but yeah.
Josh?
Yeah, he makes a great point. I think that universal testing is a waste of resources. If you think that you're sick, you stay home. That's it. The reason that I think it's a waste of resources is your treatment track doesn't change based on whether you get a positive test or negative test. You feel sick? Do you have COVID? No, stay home still because we don't want to give people the flu. Do you feel sick? Yes, get tested. You do have COVID, stay home because we don't want to give people COVID. The vast majority of people, you're not going to go to the hospital, so whether you have COVID or not, the answer is just stay home.
Yeah.
For both whether you have COVID or not.
And if you do like start having like real trouble, like breathing issues,
Right.
like respiratory issues, that's when you're like, go to a hospital and then
Yes,
get the help.
that's
that
when you
need.
get COVID.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you start having serious symptoms, when you start having things you need to go to the hospital for, okay, now we need to figure out what's wrong with you, because then the treatment paths differ. If you have COVID, then this is going to be your treatment path. If you have, say, a collapsed lung, it's going to be totally different. And so that's when you need to get tested.
All right, I'd just like to thank you guys for coming out, and this has been a well-spirited and great debate. I definitely did not picture this when I signed up for this group, and especially on this topic. So I'd just like to thank you guys. In conclusion, that we as a group have mixed opinions on the COVID mandates. It's not, and I think that's what it's really all about, guys. It's not one size fits all. It's something that, you know, none of us have lived through. I mean, unless you were born in 1918, but that's just a different story. It's something that none of us have lived through. It's something that, you know, it's a very, very terrible problem to have, but it's definitely not unbeatable. It's definitely not undefeated, as, you know, most of us have proved. It's something that, you know, is workaroundable. It's something that, you know, is going to pass eventually, and we just got to get there. So this has been Max, Josh, and Zach on the Three Bozos podcast discussing COVID mandates, and thank you for watching.